Johnny Cash's knees buckled, and he crumpled toward the edge of the stage with the microphone still in his hand. Dean Martin ran 5 steps to catch him, but Johnny's head had already gone slack against Dean's chest before his arms could brace the fall. Wait, because in the next 20 minutes, what Dean Martin said to June Carter, the decision Loretta Lynn could never forget, and the lie that saved Johnny Cash's life, never made it onto camera. It was July 26, 1973, and the Grand Ole Opry House in Nashville was preparing for something unusual. The air backstage smelled of hairspray, stale coffee, and that particular mix of wood polish and cigarette smoke that defined every theater in America. Dean Martin, the smooth Vegas crooner who'd built his career on martinis and cool sophistication, was taping a special summer episode of his variety show in country music's sacred home, and the guest list read like a who's who of Nashville royalty. Johnny Cash was scheduled to perform 2 songs. June Carter Cash was doing a comedy sketch with Dean. Loretta Lynn was singing a duet. The orchestra had flown in from Los Angeles that morning, and they were running through the arrangements one last time before the live taping started at 7 o'clock. The soundcheck had begun at 5:30, and everything was running smoothly until it wasn't. Johnny had walked onto the stage looking tired, which wasn't unusual for him in those days. He was 41 years old and fighting a battle with pills that most people in the industry knew about but politely ignored. His marriage to June had helped. Everyone said that. But the demons didn't just vanish because you loved someone. They waited for weak moments. And this afternoon in Nashville, surrounded by the pressure of performing on Dean Martin's show and the weight of representing country music to a national audience, was apparently weak enough. Dean Martin was standing near the piano, going over a comedy bit with one of the writers, when he heard the microphone hit the stage floor with that distinctive metallic thud that makes everyone stop talking. He looked up and saw Johnny swaying, his face gone pale, one hand reaching for the mic stand that was no longer there. Then Johnny's knees gave out. What happened in the next 3 seconds would determine everything that followed. Dean didn't think, didn't calculate, just moved. He covered the distance between the piano and the collapsing singer faster than anyone expected, a 56-year-old man in dress shoes to move, and he got his arms under Johnny's shoulders just as the younger man's full weight dropped. They went down together in a controlled fall, Dean taking the impact on his knees, Johnny's head lolling against Dean's chest, unconscious. Dean could feel the dampness of sweat through Johnny's shirt and the disturbing limpness of dead weight in his arms. The stage went silent, except for the hum of the amplifiers and the sudden scrape of chairs as people stood up. The orchestra members froze with their instruments. A cameraman who'd been adjusting his rig forgot what he was doing and just stared. And then June Carter Cash screamed her husband's name and started running from the wings where she'd been watching, her heels clicking rapid fire across the stage floor. Notice something important here, because this moment crystallized a choice that Dean Martin had been unconsciously preparing for his entire career. He'd grown up in Steubenville, Ohio, in an Italian immigrant family where you protected your own and you kept family business private. He'd spent 3 decades in show business learning that the show always went on, that audiences paid for magic, not reality, that you smiled through pain and saved the breakdowns for after the curtain fell. And he'd watched enough friends destroy themselves with addiction to know that shame and public exposure usually made things worse, not better. So when June Carter dropped to her knees beside him, tears already streaming down her face, and gasped, "Oh God, is he breathing?" He looked up at the production crew, at the stagehands who'd stopped what they were doing, at the orchestra members craning their necks to see what was happening, and he said in a voice that carried authority and calm, "He just needs some air, too hot under these lights. Let's get him backstage." It wasn't entirely a lie. The stage lights were hot, but it also wasn't the truth, and everyone there knew it. Johnny Cash hadn't fainted from heat. He'd collapsed from whatever combination of exhaustion and substances was running through his system. But Dean's tone left no room for discussion or panic, and people responded to that tone the way crews always did when someone took charge. Listen carefully to what happened next, because Loretta Lynn told this story only once, years later, to a documentary filmmaker who ended up cutting it from the final film. 4 stagehands helped carry Johnny to his dressing room. June Carter followed, her hand over her mouth, trying to keep her composure and failing. Dean Martin walked beside them, one hand still supporting Johnny's shoulder, his face unreadable, and Loretta Lynn, who'd been watching the whole thing from the second row of seats, abandoned her purse and followed them backstage because something in her gut said this was serious, and June was going to need help. The dressing room was small, barely big enough for the couch they laid Johnny on, and it smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap air freshener trying to cover it. Someone had put up a handwritten sign that said Mr. Cash on the door, and there were flowers in a vase from the Grand Ole Opry management welcoming him. Now those flowers sat next to an unconscious man whose breathing was shallow and whose skin had gone the color of old newspaper, clammy and cold, when Dean would check his pulse moments later. June Carter Cash sat on the edge of the couch, holding her husband's hand, and she was shaking. Not crying anymore, just shaking, like her body couldn't process what was happening and had shut down everything except the tremors. Her palm was cold and clammy against Johnny's warmer skin. "We have to cancel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have to get him to a hospital." "June." Dean Martin's voice cut through her spiral gently but firmly. He was kneeling beside the couch now, checking Johnny's pulse at his wrist, his face close enough to Johnny's to feel the breath. "His pulse is steady. He's breathing. He's going to be okay. But I need you to trust me for the next 30 minutes. June stared at him like he was speaking a language she didn't understand. 30 minutes? The show starts in 30 minutes. He needs a doctor. Dean. What he needs, Dean interrupted, and his voice was quieter now, meant just for her, is for this not to become tomorrow's headline. Johnny Cash collapses on Dean Martin's show. Country star rushed to hospital. You know what that does. You know how the press runs with that. How it follows him forever. Wait. Because this was the moment when Dean Martin revealed that he understood addiction not as an outsider judging from a distance, but as someone who'd watched it destroy people he cared about. He'd seen what happened when the media got hold of a celebrity collapse story. He'd watched careers crumble under the weight of public speculation and tabloid judgment, and he'd learned that sometimes protecting someone meant lying to everyone else. Loretta Lynn stood in the doorway, forgotten by everyone except herself, and she watched Dean Martin transform from entertainer to something else entirely. His voice dropped to the tone you'd use with a frightened child. His hands were steady on Johnny's wrist, counting pulse beats. His eyes stayed on June's face, reading every flicker of emotion, calibrating his words to what she could handle. "Here's what we're going to do," Dean said. "We're going to let him rest for 20 minutes. We're going to get some cold water and wake him up gently, and then we're going to give him the choice. If he can stand, if he can sing, we let him do the show. If he can't, then we tell the audience he's got food poisoning, and we do the episode without him. But we control the story. We don't let panic control it." June's hands were still shaking, but something in Dean's certainty seemed to reach her. "What if he can't wake up? What if it's worse than, then we call an ambulance and deal with it," Dean said simply. "But we give him the chance to wake up first. We give him the dignity of making the choice." The production assistant knocked on the door, nervous and sweating. "Mr. Martin, we're 25 minutes out. The audience is starting to seat. Do we need to make any changes to the rundown?" Dean didn't even turn around. "Tell them we're running a few minutes behind." Johnny's resting his voice. "We'll be ready." The assistant nodded and disappeared, and Dean could hear him repeating that explanation down the hallway. The lie spreading through the crew, becoming the official story. Johnny Cash is resting his voice. Everything's fine, just a small delay. Remember this, because what Dean Martin understood that most people didn't was that lies could be acts of love, not deceptions meant to harm or manipulate, but protective walls built around someone vulnerable, giving them space to recover without the world watching and judging. The lie wasn't for Dean's benefit, it was for Johnny's, and June Carter Cash, looking at her unconscious husband, seemed to grasp that distinction. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, 20 minutes." Dean stood up and looked at Loretta Lynn in the doorway. "Loretta, I need you to do something for me. Go tell the makeup girl that June needs a touch-up before the show. Make it casual. Make it sound like nothing's wrong. Then come back here." Loretta nodded and left, and her footsteps faded down the hall. Dean turned back to June. "Talk to him. Sometimes they can hear even when they're out. Tell him about the show. Tell him the songs he's supposed to sing. Remind him why he's here." June's voice cracked on the first word, but she started talking anyway. Soft, steady, telling Johnny about the orchestra arrangements and how good the band sounded, and how the audience was going to love hearing him sing Folsom Prison Blues and I Walk the Line. Her words filled the small dressing room, and Dean stepped back to give her space, his eyes on Johnny's face, watching for any sign of consciousness returning. 10 minutes passed, then 15. June's voice had steadied into something almost rhythmic, a litany of love and memory and gentle encouragement. Dean checked his watch. 13 minutes until taping. The dressing room had grown warmer, stuffy with body heat and anxiety. He could hear the audience laughter from the warm-up comedian in the studio, could feel the energy building in the building, that electric anticipation that came before a live show. And then Johnny's eyelids flickered. It was subtle, just a tremor of movement, but Dean saw it. "June," he said quietly. "Keep talking. He's coming back." June's hand tightened on Johnny's, and she leaned closer. "Johnny, honey, can you hear me? It's June. You're in Nashville. We're about to do Dean's show. Can you open your eyes for me?" Johnny's face twitched, and a sound came from his throat. Not quite a word, but close enough. His eyelids fluttered again, and this time they opened halfway, unfocused and confused, but open. "There you go," Dean said, his voice warm and encouraging. "Welcome back, John. You gave us a scare there." Johnny's eyes tried to focus on Dean's face, then slid to June, then back to Dean. "What?" His voice was rough, barely audible. "What happened?" "You took a little nap during Soundcheck," Dean said, and his tone was light, almost joking, giving Johnny a story to hold on to. "Stage lights got to you. We've all done it. How do you feel?" Johnny tried to sit up, and June helped him, one hand behind his shoulders, supporting him as he struggled to vertical. He swayed, and Dean's hand shot out to steady him, but Johnny stayed upright. "I feel like hell," he admitted, and the honesty in his voice was almost funny. "That's a good sign," Dean said. "Hell means you're alive. Can you stand?" It took 2 tries, but Johnny got his feet under him with June and Dean each holding an arm. He stood there swaying slightly, his face still pale but his eyes more focused now, and he looked around the dressing room like he was trying to piece together how he'd gotten there. The cool air from the hallway hit his face when someone opened the door, bringing with it the distant smell of popcorn from the lobby concession stand. Notice what Dean Martin didn't do in this moment. He didn't lecture. He didn't express disappointment or concern or any of the emotions that would have been normal and justified. He didn't ask what Johnny had taken or how long he'd been using or whether this had happened before. He just stood there, one hand ready to catch Johnny if he fell again, and waited for the younger man to make a choice. "The show," Johnny said, and it was half question, half statement. "We're doing the show? Only if you want to," Dean said. "If you're not up for it, we'll handle it. Nobody has to know. But if you think you can do it, the stage is yours." Johnny looked at June, and something passed between them. One of those wordless communications that happen between people who've been through hell together. June's eyes were wet, but she nodded. "You can do it," she said. "But only if you want to. Only if you're sure." Notice what June Carter wasn't saying in that moment, because the unspoken words mattered more than what came out loud. She wasn't saying, "I forgive you," or "I trust you," or even "I love you," though all of those were true. She was saying something harder. "I'll stand beside you if you fall again." That's what real love looked like in 1973 Nashville, in a cramped dressing room that smelled of cigarettes and wilting flowers. Loretta Lynn had come back and was standing in the doorway again, and she watched Johnny Cash take a deep breath and straighten his shoulders and say, "I can do it." And she watched Dean Martin's face transform into a smile, genuine and proud, like he'd just watched someone win a battle that nobody else could see. "Okay then," Dean said. "Let's get you cleaned up. 5 minutes." The next 5 minutes were controlled chaos. Makeup touched up the pallor in Johnny's face. Wardrobe straightened his black suit. June stayed close, her hand on his back, steadying him. Dean disappeared to tell the crew that everything was fine, that they were ready to start, that Johnny Cash was going to knock it out of the park. When the cameras started rolling at 7 o'clock, the studio audience saw Dean Martin walk out to applause, do his opening monologue with perfect timing, and introduce Johnny Cash as one of the greatest voices in American music. They saw Johnny walk onto the stage with that characteristic steady stride, guitar in hand, and launch into Folsom Prison Blues with a power that seemed to come from somewhere deep and untouchable. They saw him smile at June during their duet, saw him joke with Dean between songs, saw him take his bows to thunderous applause. What they didn't see was Dean Martin standing in the wings the entire time Johnny was on stage, watching with the intensity of a man ready to run if something went wrong. They didn't see June Carter's hands trembling even as she smiled and sang. They didn't see Loretta Lynn watching from the second row with tears in her eyes, because she understood she was witnessing something more profound than entertainment. Look at what that 20-minute decision cost, and what it saved. Dean Martin could have called an ambulance, could have canceled the taping, could have let the story become public and washed his hands of responsibility. It would have been the safe choice, the choice that protected him and his show from any liability. But it wouldn't have been the kind choice. And Dean Martin, for all his smooth Vegas persona and his carefully cultivated image of not caring too deeply, was fundamentally kind. Remember this, because kindness in show business is rarer than talent. Talent is everywhere. Walk into any Nashville bar or Vegas lounge, and you'll find a dozen people who can sing better than half the stars on the radio. But kindness, the kind that risks something, that puts someone else's dignity above your own convenience, that's what separates legends from footnotes. The show wrapped at 9 o'clock, and the audience filed out talking about what a great episode it had been, how Johnny Cash sounded incredible, how the chemistry between Dean and all the country stars was magic. The crew started breaking down equipment, already thinking about the next taping, the next city, the next show. In Johnny's dressing room, Dean found the singer sitting on the couch with his head in his hands while June rubbed his shoulders. Dean knocked on the doorframe even though the door was open, giving them the option to wave him away. Instead, Johnny looked up. "Dean," he said, and his voice was heavy with something that might have been gratitude, or shame, or exhaustion, or all three. "Don't," Dean interrupted gently. "You did great out there. The audience loved you. That's what matters." Johnny shook his head. "You could have canceled. You should have canceled. If something had gone wrong on camera, but it didn't," Dean said. "And you know why? Because you're a professional. Because when it counted, you showed up." He paused, then added more quietly, "But John, this can't happen again. You know that." The honesty hung in the air between them. June's hands stilled on Johnny's shoulders. Loretta, who'd followed Dean to the dressing room, held her breath. Johnny nodded slowly. "I know." 2 words, but they carried weight. Dean pulled a business card from his pocket, one of those plain white cards with just a name and a phone number. This is a doctor in Los Angeles. He specializes in helping people like us, people who got famous before they figured out how to handle it. I want you to call him. People like us. Johnny's voice was careful, questioning. Dean smiled, and it was sad and knowing. John, we all got our demons. Mine just happened to be more socially acceptable, because I built a character around them. But I know what it's like to need something to get through a show. I know what it's like to wake up, not sure you can do it again. And I know that asking for help isn't weakness. It's the only smart thing to do. Remember what Dean Martin was really offering in that moment, because it wasn't just a phone number on a business card. It was permission to be human. Permission to stop pretending the character was the same as the man. Permission to fail without shame, to struggle without judgment, to ask for help without losing respect. That's what separated legends from has-beens. Not the talent, but the willingness to admit when the talent wasn't enough anymore. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. Johnny took the card. June took it from him and tucked it into her purse, and Dean understood that meant she'd make sure the call happened. They sat there for another moment in that small dressing room with the wilting flowers and the handwritten sign. Three people who'd just been through something that couldn't be fully explained, but didn't need to be. The story of that night in Nashville lived on in different ways. The episode aired as scheduled and got strong ratings. Johnny Cash did call that doctor, and while his road to recovery wasn't smooth or simple, it was a road he walked with June beside him. Dean Martin never spoke publicly about what happened during Soundcheck, treating it with the same privacy he'd have given to a confession in a church, and Loretta Lynn kept the full story quiet for decades, understanding that some moments of grace are too fragile to expose to scrutiny. Sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is give them the space to fail privately and the chance to succeed publicly. Sometimes a lie told with love saves more than the truth told with judgment. And sometimes the real measure of a legend isn't what they do on camera, but what they do in the 30 minutes before the cameras roll, when nobody's watching except the people who need help and the people strong enough to give it. If you want to hear about the night Dean Martin stood up to Frank Sinatra over this same thing, tell me in the comments.